sanctuary of Shelbyville provides a safe haven for women fleeing lives of domestic violence. Why would my small, calm hometown of Shelbyville, Indiana need such a place? The fact is that domestic violence is a problem that occurs in all places, regardless of size. Domestic violence is the abuse of one intimate partner by the other. By virtue of their physical nature, women are the most likely victims of this abuse. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in a lifetime. 4 million will experience assaults and rapes because of their partner. 1 in 3 female homicides will be committed by a current or former partner. Unfortunately, domestic violence has sometimes been viewed as a personal issue and not one of social and public policy. This societal attitude has significantly changed over the course of the past 3 decades. The costs and consequences associated with domestic violence are primarily responsible for this attitude change. According to the Domestic Violence Hotline, 3 million children annually witness domestic abuse. These children are more likely to experience a variety of social problems like homelessness and substance abuse. Annual legal, medical, and social costs of domestic abuse amount to more than $37 billion. To get a better insight on domestic violence, I interviewed Debbie Snodgrass. Debbie is a labor delivery nurse at IU Health, and she lost a dear friend due to domestic violence.
She worked on the postpartum unit. She was a mother of 2 and got divorced. We knew her for a few years and always knew that her husband was odd and was controlling, but no one at all knew the extent of maybe what was happening in their home. And unfortunately, they did divorce, and after that divorce, her husband just had, I guess, a moment of rage and showed up where she was living and killed her in front of her children, who were young at the time. And the unit was absolutely devastated because we thought he was just odd. We had no idea that this could end up this way at all. I went to the hospital to see Beth in the emergency room, and she was unrecognizable to me. She'd been beaten so badly, and Beth died, I believe, a day or 2 later in the hospital. So unfortunately, we have had experience with this. We as nurses do have suspicions at times with patients that we think might where we have a concern about domestic violence or even verbal abuse, whether it's the husband or the wife, but usually the wife is our concern. And when you ask them about it, when they're a patient, you have to take their word and what they say, even if your suspicion is telling you something different, and that's very difficult for all of us. But what we hope that it does is tells the patient that every time you come to the hospital, for whatever reason, you will be asked about domestic violence, and hopefully one time they will say that they do need help or that there is violence in their home, and we can elicit help from their physician or a social worker or protective services, security, something like that. So what is difficult is when we have a suspicion and the patient tells us everything's fine, and for that hospitalization, that's what we have to go on. Because of Beth's death at IU Health, we have began questioning all male and female patients about domestic violence in their home when they are alone. So if it's a postpartum patient, we wait until her husband is not in the room, and we ask her about domestic violence, and we screen her for domestic violence, whether it's abuse or physical abuse. And we've done that for the last year or 2 for every patient because of Beth, with the hope that perhaps one of them will admit that there is violence or abuse and ask for help, and maybe that's what that hospitalization is about, and the help would come from their physician, social worker, protective services, and any of the domestic violence groups within Indiana, including the Domestic Violence Alliance at IU Health.
I also interviewed Pat Hartnett, an Indianapolis Metropolitan Police officer, to give his professional opinion. What do you see as the main cause of domestic violence?
Well, there are a number of causes. One of them is, to a certain extent, a learned behavior of certain socioeconomic groups that have the concept that a man can be in control of a woman regardless of the relationship, whether it's a boyfriend-girlfriend or husband-wife type of relationship. And you can even go back as recent as a few decades to find out that behavior or that acceptance to some degree that there was domestic violence as you go back into the 40s and 50s. It wasn't reported as aggressively as it is now. However, that was part of the problem there, that non-reporting of that particular behavior kind of allowed it to grow over generations. So that attitude of dominance within the family was an issue that unfortunately was allowed to flourish over those generations. There's also other factors involved, such as conflict resolution. Many of the abusers that you'll see, and most of the time it's men, it's not exclusively men, but most of the times it's the male in the relationship that is the abuser. But the inability of that person to sit down when there is a conflict or some type of problem, obstacle within the relationship, and simply talk it out or trying to find other solutions to the problem, as opposed to just immediately becoming angry, becoming upset, and then becoming physical.
What common themes do you see?
Well, you see a lot of times, as I mentioned, that the male is quite often the aggressor, not exclusively as I mentioned earlier, but the male is the one that, because of physical strength sometimes, the person that would become more violent. And we do see cases where women can pick up an object and hit a guy just like a guy can pick up an object and hit a woman. So it's not just exclusive to men, but probably predominant in that area. One thing we do see is that females will, because of the fear of safety for themselves, and quite often there are children involved, they'll call the police because that immediate fear of being injured or seeing their kids injured. Police will arrive, they'll make an arrest, and then when it comes down later to prosecution or coming to court or being cooperative with detectives or investigators, at that point they'll become uncooperative because now they're fearful that there may be retaliation, or they're fearful that that relationship, they want that back. There's an emotional attachment to the person that battered them, so now they're feeling guilty, which they shouldn't obviously feel guilty about, but they have feelings of guilt, anxiety, and there's a theme sometimes of them being uncooperative.
How has law enforcement evolved to address this issue?
Law enforcement, especially in the past 20 years, have really become much more aggressive with it. There are a couple of landmark cases throughout the United States where law enforcement agencies have been sued successfully, civilly, in federal court and other courts because they did not, by the opinion of the court, do enough to keep a woman safe. So we've had instances where women have been killed or hurt quite severely because traditionally in some jurisdictions law enforcement wasn't as aggressive as they should have been. So now you have certain things going on. One of them is mandatory arrest. So when many states have it, Indiana has it to a degree. It's still discretionary with the officer, but there are some states, and I believe Florida is one, where if law enforcement arrives on the scene and there's any sign whatsoever from a person that has a small cut on their hand to a complaint of physical pain, somebody has to go to jail that night. Sometimes both parties go to jail that night.
With a picture of Beth as we remember her and hope that because of her and because of her death that we're able to help just one patient.